It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist Douglas Blackmon. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to American Forum. I'm Doug Blackmon. We've all just survived a presidential election that for many of us felt unlike any previous one in recent history. It was ugly, and the most powerful motivation for millions of Americans wasn't how much they liked the candidate they supported, but making sure the other one didn't win. So we watched two candidates with deep unfavorability ratings battling it out, mostly on issues of personality, rather than the enormous technological, demographic, and generational issues facing our society. Why was that? Have we simply become a democracy that views our political process as sport or tribal affinity? Do big changes in society shape our elections? Or is it the other way around? Do specific candidates and the ultimate selection we make as a people fundamentally alter the course of our history? The United States has had several pivotal elections that we are taught deeply changed America. Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and the Civil War that followed, the 1932 election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt leading to the New Deal, societal changes leading to the 1992 election of Bill Clinton, Teddy Roosevelt's re-election in 1904. What about 2016? Was it just an ugly aberration, or did something really profound happen? Our guest today is Margaret O'Mara, a professor of history at the University of Washington and the author of two books, including Pivotal Tuesdays, 4 Elections That Shaped the 20th Century. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
In recent times, not just in the most recent election, but in recent years, there's been a lot of debate about what actually makes an election turn out a particular way, what makes it pivotal, does the substance of the issues of the country really matter? But if we look at things over a broader period of time, what you've written about, what is it that makes a presidential election truly pivotal?
Well, it's hard. In some way, you could say every election in its way is pivotal every 4 years. But really, the elections where you have a change of power, either a change of party or you have a new president of the same party coming in, are usually the ones that attract the most heat and light and where most changes are happening. The way that I wrote a book that focused on 4 elections in the 20th century. Look, I could have written a book about 25. It would have been a really big book. But I chose the 4 not just because they were these moments of a new person coming in, but also because they were reflective of larger changes going on, which every election is. Economic changes, moving from an industrial to a post-industrial society, for example. Changes in the media, because the media and the message matter in presidential elections, and the ability of a candidate to really grasp and use the newest media platform of the era often has a big impact on whether they're going to be successful. And the other thing that drew me to these particular races was the presence of third-party or independent voices that may not have won the race, but changed the trajectory of the race and left their imprint on what happened next.
So if we look at the 4 elections that you're talking about, or if there were another one you wanted to bring into it, of those 4, which might you say, or pick 2, but what would you say would be ones that, in terms of fundamentally altering the course of American history? I guess FDR's election, that's one that I think no one could argue with that as an absolutely basal change in American history. But what's of the others, what might you say would be the most historic with a capital H?
Well, the election of 1912 is one where you had again, reflective of incredible changes in society, and I think it's an election that has a lot of resonance right now in 2016 and then the contemporary era.
Talk about that.
Imagine if you were born and if you were 50 years old in 1912, you've been born into an America that was mostly agricultural, where most people were farmers, small town, not an industrial power. By 1912, you would be living in a place that was on its way to becoming 50% urban in terms of population, where you had these giant industrial cities, these huge factories belching smoke, and you had millions of immigrants from all around the world, including Southern and Eastern Europe, coming into the United States and really changing and challenging what it meant to be an American. So in this incredible change, unlike today, you didn't have a very large central government as a countervailing force against the forces of big business or this incredible industrial growth. And so 1912 became this debate that in some ways was a perennial debate in American politics about the questions of how much power should the government have and how do you balance individual rights with collective responsibility. But it became a debate where there were voices calling for larger government. Many of those voices were coming from the Republican side of the aisle. And on the Democratic side of the aisle were arguments against a stronger Washington presence, for perhaps some more government activism, but activism at the state and local level.
With the old system breaking down, how did the outcome of that election, or did the outcome of the election, shape the next several decades of American history?
Mm-hmm. Well, going into 1912, the Republican Party was the party, you might say, more closely associated with progressive politics, or this idea that there needed to be a professionalized, larger government entities that were in some ways regulating or controlling these uncontrolled forces of the market, protecting workers, et cetera. Now, progressive politics of that type was found both in the Republican and the Democratic parties. But what happens in 1912 is that Teddy Roosevelt, who had been president, a former president, kind of like in 2016, you had very familiar names in the race, or some of the names were very familiar. He had left the White House, had effectively handed over the keys to his handpicked successor, William Howard Taft, who was a Republican of a very similar stripe to Teddy Roosevelt. That Taft and Roosevelt were really not that far away on policy terms, in terms of how they approached the business of governing. But Teddy Roosevelt really didn't like not being president anymore. He was pretty young, he was vigorous, and he thought that Taft was really not holding up to his legacy quite well enough. So he comes in 1912, first runs against his old friend Taft for the Republican primary, creates this huge rift within the Republican Party. And in doing so, Taft eventually wrings out the nomination from the GOP. When that happens, Roosevelt bolts and becomes the flag bearer of the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party. And because of that rift, who wins? The Democrat, a guy that most people hadn't heard of 2 years earlier, Woodrow Wilson, the former governor of New Jersey, a history professor, among other things. And so the reason this has a lasting effect is, after that, the Democrats become the party of reform. They become the party of progressive, of a more active government. Many of the things that are talked about, the broad concepts that are talked about in 1912, are realized eventually in Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt, a Democrat.
What's interesting about 1912, and that I wonder about the parallels to the present, again, not taking them too far, but you have the Republican Party goes through a definitional crisis leading up to that election. If there's any lesson we might draw from 1912 to suggest where the Republican Party, as it goes through this identity crisis after 2016, is where that's likely to go. What do you think?
Well, the Republicans in 1912, or the Democrats in 1968 for that matter, are good object lessons that, it's evidence we can take and balance when asking that question, hey, what's going to happen to the Republican Party after 2016? And the lessons from what we've learned from history is that the two major parties are remarkably resilient, remarkably dynamic. They bend to fit. They do not break. The last time we lost a major party, we had a civil war in our hands, the goodbye Whigs, and they weren't around all that long. So you were still in it's very hard to draw those comparisons to the modern era where you have incredibly durable modern parties, but as you pointed out, extremely dynamic, where the constituencies change. Sure, the Republicans may, become the party of business and fiscal conservatism, starting with the more laissez-faire 1920s, but it still was the party of the Northeast. It still was an urban party. It was a party of kind of upper middle class, small business people and business people. It was the party of African Americans until the era of Franklin Roosevelt. So this change comes gradually, but it does happen. And what parties have to do, and where these when third-party inroads are these moments of great anti-establishment anxiety. I mean, when you have a lot of change, economic change, social change, that is a time when skepticism about the ability of established institutions, whether they be government or big business or big political parties, to do the job, that's when it crests. And we're seeing that in 2016, as we've seen in earlier eras. And that is a time when parties really do need to reckon with how do they respond to these new forces. And oftentimes the response has been to bring them in some way.
And so another year of both a third-party impact or a schismatic impact would be 1968. And so in that year we have George Wallace very much so both affecting the course of events, but also introducing, arguably, the idea, George Wallace also arguably introducing the idea that a discrete subset of voters called different things at different times, but that has existed in American politics forever, perhaps, but certainly over the past 50 years, and that being in 1968, seeming very openly racist group of lower income, working class white voters, primarily in the South, but also, to the surprise of some at the time, blue collar workers in other parts of the country. As the years have gone by, that constituency has not had the explicit racial overtone that it had when it was organizing in the 1960s, but still a traceable group of voters expressing a certain kind of economic anxiety, worry in the face of big demographic changes. Like in the 60s, the demographic change was simply the way we were reordering the treatment of the people who were already here, and to some degree some immigration. Now demographic change is driven more by outsiders coming in. But this anxious group of mostly white, working class voters, they've also been a big factor in recent politics, even before 2016, obviously a huge part of the Trump phenomenon. But first, is that a fair observation to make, that this is essentially the same cohort over the past 50 years?
Well, I think, the case of, the dotted line from Wallace to Trump is it opens up this, what it reminds us of is that pivotal political moments or political electoral moments don't always happen on election day. The one thing that Wallace and everything after was responding to was this fundamental realignment of the political map, which was in the wake of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. When the solidly Democratic South, the white South, gradually, not immediately, but gradually over time, and starting with inroads as early as 1966, the Republican Party starts winning elections in the South. And some of it is moderate Republicans like George H.W. Bush in Texas, who's one of the earlier Southern victors of that shift. But it is increasingly over time either Democrats who had been staunch supporters of segregation switching parties. Strom Thurmond comes to mind as an example of that. And you have this racial reordering of society. The thing that makes, and I think it has been so difficult to talk about this phenomenon and kind of is it race, is it economics? And when we look at it, though, through the long view and say, take 1964 as our starting point, you have a period of enlarging rights for so many groups, not just people of color, but also women, gays and lesbians, this enlarging of who gets to fully participate in different careers in different parts of society, in enlarging of where people can live and do live, a real reordering of that. And it's happening at the same time that the American economic pie is contracting for a whole host of reasons, for globalization, automation, the robot overlords have taken away some of the jobs. And because as that pie shrinks, and now you have more people able to get a piece of that pie, if you were somebody who was advantaged under the old system, you're seeing opportunities slip away, and you're seeing people who don't look like you now competing for these opportunities.
I think it's fascinating that if you look at the last 10 years of American political life, you see all of the things you were just describing. You also see the election of the first black president, this event which clearly many people who ultimately voted for or at some point were sympathetic to Donald Trump during 2016 also voted for Barack Obama in 2008. But what does that say about where we're going beyond 2016? Because certainly you had Donald Trump representing a group of very disaffected voters, reaching back to law and order and racial tropes. You had Bernie Sanders representing a group of younger, disenchanted, worried, but not so much racially divided voters, but concerned about income inequality. Even Gary Johnson, the libertarian, economically similar in some respects to a Donald Trump, but missing some of the racial dimensions. But what would you, looking back at history, I know you're not a crystal ball,
Yeah.
but yeah, where do you imagine all of this heading? Is it a sustained period of struggle between those forces, or something else?
Yeah. Well, the long view in some ways is reassuring because you have a healthy sense of how nasty elections have gotten in the past, and we soldiered through. The long view also reminds us that the parties can be durable. And that, the last 50 years have seen, in some ways, a sharp turn in a rightward direction, and a direction towards smaller government, and also a sharp turn towards a reanimating of divides that perhaps were papered over the middle part of the 20th century, and where people are asserting their identities more sharply in both positive and negative ways. You also, at the same time, and the election of Barack Obama is a proof point of this, as is the nomination of Hillary Clinton as the first female nominee of a major party in 2016, that there is this growing social liberalism and a growing acceptance, particularly when you're looking at younger people and the way their attitudes about race, their attitudes about gender and sexuality, which are, regardless of the background and the political background of these younger people, seems to be quite different from their elders. And so you have this strange contradictory politics that is, I imagine, will endure. And it is all made, part of what we're operating with right now is, again, going back to how communication media shapes a particular election and electoral moment. We're now in the era of the fire hose of information and the radical transparency of social media and the internet, where it's sound bites have been replaced by hot takes, and everyone has a hot take. And on the one hand, it creates this cacophony of voices, and including some very angry and some incredibly nasty and violent voices. Perhaps, it's easy to be more angry and more violent when you have a cloak of anonymity and a computer screen, rather than doing it in person, but that doesn't mean it won't be personal. But there also is this conversation going on, and this frank conversation about racial inequality, about gender, about social inequality and economic inequality that the United States hasn't experienced for quite some time, but these things have been brewing and have been there. It's just that perhaps they haven't all been wrestled with in such an immediate way as they have been in this incredible, fateful year of 2016.
You also have written some about the transition from you were a volunteer in Bill Clinton's campaigin in 1992.
Oh, they paid me a healthy salary, Doug.
Oh, that's right. You were first a volunteer, but then you were paid.
Yeah,
right. But you've written some about the transition from campaigning for that campaign into actual governing.
Yeah.
But so let's say if it's February of 2017, and you get a phone call from the office of now the new President Clinton, who perhaps perfectly remembering everything you did back in 1992 or not, but you get a phone call from the new President Clinton's office saying, come talk to the president for a few minutes, and based on these observations that you've made, the observations from 92 as well, what's the one piece of advice you would give to me now as a historian for how I can begin to try to wrestle with these forces you've just outlined and move the country past what has been this terrible moment?
Yeah. Well, election season is all about change. This year, and gosh, every year, everyone's promising hope and change and big, bold promises. But the reality of governing is much more prosaic and much less glamorous. And where the real change comes is actually in that first year of the presidency, not just the first 100 days, but the first year. That is when all the forces, all the heat and light of this campaign, suddenly, everyone who ends up being in charge has to wrestle with the realities of that. The lessons from the first Clinton presidency and the first year of that presidency include, the challenge of finding the balance between inspiring and getting, you do need to think big and use big words and have big ideas in order to make voters come along with your ideas. And certainly Bill Clinton in '93 was proposing big stuff: economic package, healthcare reform, trade deals, all these, and high-flying language accompanied all of that. The reality is that you have to meet Congress in the middle. You have to meet all the other political interests in the middle. This year, particularly, is going to be one where, just as Richard Nixon, as he entered office in 1969, having won 1968 in this fractious election, had to reckon with and accommodate all of the contending voices, including voices not of his party, the anti-war movement, what was he going to do about Vietnam, the environmental movement, what was he as a Republican going to do about this great concern about environmental protection. That a new president, that is when change comes. It is figuring out how to respond to where the real concerns actually depart from just electoral rhetoric. And not do too much too soon, but yet inspire and lead.
So now let's imagine that it's February 2017 and you get a phone call from the office of the newly elected President Donald Trump, saying, in particular, looking back at history and willing to disregard that you had once worked in a Clinton campaign in the 1990s.
I'm a nonpartisan entity now.
So Donald Trump, who's not a big reader of books, as he has said, likes things boiled down, and you're asked to come to the Oval Office and brief him for a few minutes on, in particular, looking back at these pivotal elections when the country was deeply divided, and he wants to make a good faith effort to try to heal some of the wounds that have been so dramatically bared. What's your counsel to President Trump?
Well, Donald Trump likes deals, so I'd say here's the deal, Donald Trump. One of the things that propelled you to the White House was this incredible dissatisfaction with a broken Washington system, or a Washington system where there was so little common ground between the parties. And the Republican Party had decided it spent 20 years sort of as a tactical maneuver, really, rather than presenting alternative legislation when they had a Democrat in power, to just say no. And that has resulted in not very much. So you've busted up the GOP by getting into office. Clearly, big change. Take this as your mandate, not as a mandate to do outrageous things, but as a mandate to really really redefine what the Republican Party, and along with it, the Democratic Party is going to be. How are both parties going to address these simmering questions, these divides in America that have been caused by this confluence? How can opportunity be preserved? This widening of opportunity, which has been so important, this inclusivity, this diversity. How do you have that diverse, pluralistic society that also is a society of opportunity? And what are you going to do about it? And here's your opportunity. You threw out the rule book and the playbook during the campaign. Throw out that playbook and think about how you rebuild a new partisan coalition or bipartisan coalition that's going to make government in America great again.
I've asked a lot of people a version of that question at this table. I think that's the best one that I've got. Margaret O'Mara, thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
Her book is Pivotal Tuesdays: 4 Elections That Shaped the 20th Century. If you'd like to send us a comment about this episode or join an ongoing conversation about the big issues that face us all, Go to the Miller Center Facebook page or follow us on Twitter. My handle is @DouglasBlackman. Our guest is @Margaret O'Mara. To watch other episodes of American Forum, share them with your friends, join our email list, or read a transcript of this dialogue, visit us at millercenter.org. American Forum. I'm Doug Blackman. See you again next week.